The amber light of dusk pooled through the curtains of Emma Keating's modest home, illuminating the fine layer of dust that had settled on the piano untouched since James had walked out 3 months ago. Dust motes danced in the dying sunlight, a bitter reminder of all the promises that had scattered just as easily into the Wyoming Territory air. The year was 1875, and Wheatland was a town where everyone knew your business, especially when your husband abandoned you for the gold fields of California with nothing more than a hastily scrawled note and empty promises to send for you once he'd made his fortune. Emma's fingers trembled as she folded the last letter she'd received from James. 2 months ago, the words still able to cut deeper than any knife. "The gold's plentiful here, Em. I'll send for you soon. Just need to establish myself properly." No money had accompanied the letter. No date for when soon might be. Just hollow words on cheap paper that had traveled across mountains and deserts to remind her that she wasn't worth staying for. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the emptiness of the small house. Emma had never noticed how loudly it sounded before James left. Now it was a constant reminder of time passing, of days turning into weeks, and weeks into months of waiting for a man who seemed to have forgotten her entirely. The knock at her door startled her out of her melancholy. Emma hastily wiped her eyes, straightened her simple blue cotton dress, and tucked a loose strand of honey blonde hair behind her ear. Visitors were rare these days. Most folks in town had given up on her after the first month, their pity turning to whispers about poor Emma Keating and her no-good husband. When she opened the door, the last person she expected to see was Jacob Norwood, hat in hand, with 2 steaming cups of coffee and an expression somewhere between nervous and determined on his weather-beaten face. "Evening, Mrs. Keating," he said, his voice deep and gentle as the breeze that rustled the cottonwood trees. "Thought you might like some company and coffee." Jacob was known throughout Wheatland as one of the most skilled horse trainers in the territory. His ranch sat just outside of town, and while Emma had seen him in passing at church or the general store, they'd never exchanged more than pleasantries. He was a few years older than her 24 years, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long days under the harsh western sun. "Mr. Norwood," Emma replied, her surprise evident. "Aye, thank you, but I'm not really receiving visitors these days." Jacob didn't flinch at her rejection. Instead, he offered a small, understanding smile. "The coffee'll get cold," he said simply. "And sometimes a person needs company even when they think they don't." He held out one of the tin cups. "I'll keep you company, Mrs. Keating, just for a spell. No need for conversation if you don't want it." There was something in his steady gaze that broke through the wall Emma had carefully built around herself. Perhaps it was the lack of pity in his eyes, or maybe it was just the simple human kindness of bringing coffee to a neighbor in need. Whatever the reason, Emma found herself stepping back from the doorway. "I suppose I could use a cup of coffee," she conceded, gesturing for him to enter. Jacob stepped into the small parlor, his tall frame making the room seem even smaller. He handed her one of the cups, careful not to spill a drop, and waited for her to settle in her rocking chair before taking a seat on the plain wooden chair nearby. "Sugar's in there already," he said. "Hope it's not too sweet." Emma took a sip, the warmth of the coffee spreading through her chest like a forgotten memory of comfort. "It's perfect," she murmured, surprised that it was exactly how she liked it. They sat in silence for a few moments, the ticking of the clock no longer quite so oppressive with another person in the room. Emma studied Jacob over the rim of her cup. His hands were calloused from years of working with horses and cattle, but there was a gentleness to the way he held his coffee. His sandy hair was neatly trimmed, and his clothes, while worn, were clean and well kept. "Why are you here, Mr. Norwood?" Emma finally asked. Unable to contain her curiosity any longer, Jacob set his cup down on the small side table. "Truth is, Mrs. Keating, I've been meaning to stop by for some time now. Didn't seem right, you being all alone out here." "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself," Emma replied, a defensive edge to her voice. "Never said you weren't," Jacob answered easily. "But even the strongest folks need a friendly face now and then." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "My mother was left alone when my pa died in '58. I was just a boy, but I remember how the loneliness ate at her even more than the grief." Emma's fingers tightened around her cup. "My husband isn't dead, Mr. Norwood. He's in California, seeking his fortune." Jacob nodded, not challenging her words even though they both knew the difference between a man who died and a man who chose to leave was vast and painful. "All the same, thought you might appreciate knowing there's folks in town who still think about you." "Folks?" Emma raised an eyebrow. "Or just you?" A slight flush crept up Jacob's neck, visible even in the fading light. "Well, I can only speak for myself, madam." Despite herself, Emma felt the corners of her mouth tug upward. It was the first time she'd come close to smiling in months. "I appreciate the coffee, Mr. Norwood, and the company." They talked as the sun disappeared completely and Emma lit the oil lamps. Simple talk of the weather, the spring planting, the new shipment of goods at Harper's General Store. Nothing of consequence, yet by the time Jacob stood to leave, Emma realized she had gone 2 full hours without thinking about James and the ache of his absence. "I should be going," Jacob said, placing his hat back on his head. "Got horses that need tending early tomorrow." Emma walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to see him go. The house would feel emptier now, she knew. "Thank you for the coffee, Mr. Norwood." "Jacob," he corrected gently. "Seeing as we've shared coffee, seems only right you call me by my Christian name." "Jacob," Emma repeated, the name feeling strange yet comfortable on her tongue. "Thank you." He nodded, his blue eyes warm in the lamplight. "I ride by here most evenings on my way back from town," he said casually. "Wouldn't be any trouble to stop again sometime. That is, if you wouldn't mind the company." Emma hesitated. Accepting his offer felt somehow like a betrayal of James, yet the thought of another evening of conversation instead of silence was tempting beyond measure. "I wouldn't mind," she finally said, surprising herself with her honesty. Jacob's smile was quick and genuine. "Good night then, Mrs. Keating." "Emma," she offered in return. "If I'm to call you Jacob, then you should call me Emma." With a tip of his hat, Jacob stepped out into the night. "Good night, Emma. I'll see you soon." As she closed the door behind him, Emma leaned against it, her heart beating a little faster than usual. For the first time since James had left, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow. True to his word, Jacob Norwood appeared at Emma's door the following evening, this time with a small sack of sugar cookies from the bakery. "Mrs. Peterson was baking today," he explained as Emma invited him in. "Thought you might enjoy something sweet." Over the next 2 weeks, Jacob's visits became a ritual. Sometimes he brought coffee, other times small tokens, a bouquet of wildflowers, a new pencil for her to write with, once even a book of poetry he'd purchased from a traveling salesman. They were simple gifts, thoughtful rather than extravagant, and each one chipped away at the wall of grief Emma had built around her heart. She learned about Jacob's life, how he'd come to Wyoming Territory as a young man of 18, worked as a ranch hand until he saved enough to buy his own small spread, and slowly built a reputation for having the finest horses in 3 counties. He spoke of his dreams to expand his ranch, to breed horses that combined beauty with the hardiness needed for life in the West. In turn, Emma found herself sharing pieces of her own life, her childhood in Illinois, her marriage to James at 19, their journey west with dreams of building a life together. She spoke of her love of music, how she used to play the piano for church socials before shame and grief had kept her shuttered in her home. What she didn't share was the full truth of James's departure, how their last months together had been filled with arguments, his growing restlessness, his dissatisfaction with the life they'd built. She didn't mention how he'd gambled away most of their savings before leaving, or how she'd been forced to take in mending and laundry to keep food on her table. Some wounds were still too raw to expose to the light. One evening in late April, as they sat on Emma's small porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jacob finally broached the subject they'd both been dancing around. "There's a social at the church this Saturday," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. First one of the spring season. Emma tensed slightly. She hadn't attended a social event since James left, unable to bear the pitying glances and hushed conversations that stopped whenever she approached. "I'm aware," she said quietly. Jacob turned to look at her, his expression earnest. "I'd be honored if you'd accompany me, Emma," her hands stilled in her lap. "I don't think that would be appropriate, Jacob. I'm still a married woman." "I'm asking as a friend," he clarified quickly. "Nothing improper about two friends attending a community gathering together." Emma looked down at her hands, at the simple gold band that still circled her finger. "People will talk. People already talk," Jacob replied gently. "Wouldn't you rather give them something new to talk about? Show them that Emma Keating is more than just a woman left behind?" His words struck a chord deep within her. Was that all she was now? A cautionary tale, an object of pity? The thought kindled a spark of defiance in her chest. "You're right," she said, lifting her chin. "I would like to attend the social." Jacob's smile was as bright as the setting sun. "I'll come by at 6 on Saturday, then." As he rode away that evening, Emma found herself standing on the porch long after his figure had disappeared down the dusty road. For the first time in months, she felt something stirring within her, something that felt dangerously like hope. Saturday arrived with a crystalline sky and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming wildflowers. Emma spent the afternoon in a flurry of preparation, washing her hair and setting it in careful curls, pressing her best dress, a simple but pretty creation of blue calico with white lace trim that she hadn't worn since Christmas. As she dressed, Emma caught sight of herself in the small mirror above her washstand. The woman who looked back at her was thinner than she remembered, with shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. But there was color in her cheeks today, a brightness in her hazel eyes that had been absent for too long. Jacob arrived promptly at 6, looking handsome and somewhat nervous in a clean white shirt, dark vest, and his best boots polished to a shine. He'd trimmed his beard and combed his hair neatly back, and when his eyes fell on Emma, the admiration in them made her blush. "You look beautiful, Emma," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, feeling oddly shy. "You clean up quite nicely yourself." The church hall was decorated with paper streamers and wildflowers, lanterns casting a warm glow over the assembled townspeople. A small group of musicians played in the corner, a fiddle, a guitar, and a harmonica, creating lively tunes that had several couples already dancing. As Jacob and Emma entered, conversation faltered briefly as heads turned in their direction. Emma felt her courage waver under the weight of so many stares, but Jacob's steady presence beside her gave her strength. He nodded politely to the onlookers and guided Emma toward the refreshment table with a gentle hand at her elbow. "Ignore them," he murmured. "They'll find something new to gossip about soon enough." Mrs. Harper, the general store owner's wife, was the first to approach them, her round face wreathed in a genuine smile. "Emma Keating, it's so good to see you out and about again. We've missed you at our quilting circle." "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," Emma replied, touched by the woman's warmth. "It's good to be here." Others followed Mrs. Harper's lead, coming over to greet Emma and welcome her back to community life. If there were still whispers and sidelong glances, they were largely drowned out by the music and the general goodwill of neighbors happy to see one of their own rejoining their midst. When the musicians struck up a waltz, Jacob turned to Emma with a question in his eyes. "Would you care to dance, Emma?" She hesitated, suddenly acutely aware of her wedding ring. Dancing with another man felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Yet the music called to her, and the simple human pleasure of movement after so many months of stillness was a temptation she couldn't resist. "Yes," she said softly. "I would like that very much." Jacob led her onto the floor, his hand warm and steady against her waist. He moved with surprising grace for a man who spent his days on horseback, guiding Emma through the steps of the waltz with confidence. "I didn't know you could dance," Emma said as they turned. Jacob's smile was self-deprecating. "My mother insisted I learn. Said no son of hers would grow up to be a clumsy oaf at social gatherings." His eyes softened. "She would have liked you, I think." As they danced, Emma became aware of a lightness in her chest, a buoyancy she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. For these few minutes, circling the floor in Jacob's arms, she wasn't the abandoned wife, the object of pity and gossip. She was simply Emma, a young woman enjoying a spring social like any other. When the music ended, Jacob reluctantly released her. "Thank you for the dance," he said, his voice husky with an emotion Emma wasn't ready to name. The remainder of the evening passed in a pleasant blur of conversation, refreshments, and more dancing. Emma found herself laughing at Sheriff Williams's stories, discussing garden plans with Mrs. Peterson, and even agreeing to rejoin the church choir. By the time Jacob escorted her home, the moon was high in the sky and Emma felt as though she'd awakened from a long, dark sleep. "I had a wonderful time tonight," she said as they stood on her porch. "Thank you for convincing me to go." Jacob's face was half in shadow, but his eyes shone in the moonlight. "It was my pleasure, Emma, truly." There was a moment of silence between them charged with unspoken words. Then Jacob cleared his throat and took a step back. "I should let you get some rest. Good night, Emma." "Good night, Jacob," she replied, watching as he returned to his horse and rode away into the darkness. Inside, Emma moved through her nighttime routine with a strange mix of emotions. The evening had been lovely, a reminder that life continued even when it seemed unbearable. Yet as she removed her dress and jewelry, her wedding ring seemed to weigh heavily on her hand, a physical reminder of promises made and broken. James had been gone for nearly 4 months now, with only that one letter to show he even remembered her existence. Emma stood by the window, twisting the gold band around her finger as she stared up at the star-filled sky. Somewhere under these same stars, James was pursuing his dreams of wealth and adventure while she remained behind, waiting. But for how long would she wait? And what was she waiting for a man who had chosen gold over his marriage vows, or simply for permission to begin living again? Sleep eluded Emma that night as these questions circled in her mind, leaving her with no clear answers, but a growing sense that something fundamental had shifted within her, like the first spring thaw after a bitter winter. May arrived with gentle rains that turned the Wyoming landscape into a tapestry of green, dotted with wildflowers. Emma found herself venturing out more often to church, to town for supplies, occasionally even to visit neighbors. If people still talked about her, She chose not to notice, focusing instead on reclaiming pieces of the life she had let slip away during her months of isolation. Jacob continued his evening visits, though they were sometimes interrupted by the demands of his ranch. Spring was a busy season for a horse breeder, with new foals to tend and training to begin. Still, he made time to ride by Emma's house 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes staying for just a few minutes, other times lingering until the stars emerged. One balmy evening in mid-May, Jacob arrived looking particularly pleased with himself. "I've got something to show you," he announced as Emma greeted him at the door. "If you're willing to take a short ride, that is." Emma hesitated. She hadn't been on a horse since before James left, and the thought of venturing beyond the safety of her home and the town made her nervous. Yet Jacob's enthusiasm was contagious, and curiosity got the better of her caution. "Let me get my shawl," she agreed. Jacob helped her mount behind him on his sturdy bay gelding, his hands strong and sure as he lifted her onto the horse's back. Emma settled herself sideways on the saddle, one hand gripping the cantle while the other rested lightly on Jacob's shoulder for balance. "Hold on tight," he advised as he urged the horse forward. "It's not far, just over the ridge past Thompson Creek." The ride was both exhilarating and terrifying for Emma. The closeness of Jacob's solid form before her, the rhythm of the horse beneath them, the sweep of the landscape as they rode it all combined to make her heart race with a mixture of fear and something that felt alarmingly like joy. They crested a gentle hill, and Jacob reined in the horse. Below them lay a small valley, lush with spring grass, through which a clear stream meandered. Near the water stood a weathered but sturdy cabin, smoke curling from its chimney. A small corral beside it held several horses, and in a nearby pasture, a mare and her gangly foal grazed peacefully. "Your ranch," Emma breathed, taking in the scene before her. Jacob nodded, a note of pride in his voice. "It's not much compared to some of the big spreads, but it's mine. Every board of that cabin, every post in that fence, I put them there with my own hands." As they rode closer, Emma could see the care that had gone into the place. The cabin was small but well maintained, with a covered porch and curtains visible in the windows. The yard was neat, with a vegetable garden beginning to sprout along one side and flowers planted near the door. "It's lovely, Jacob," Emma said sincerely as he helped her dismount in front of the cabin. "You've built something really special here." A pleased flush colored his cheeks at her praise. "Come see what I wanted to show you," he said, leading her toward the corral. Inside the wooden enclosure, 3 horses lifted their heads to watch their approach. 2 were clearly working stock, sturdy, practical animals with alert eyes and strong legs. But it was the 3rd horse that drew Emma's gaze and held it. She was a mare of extraordinary beauty, with a coat the color of burnished copper and a flowing mane and tail several shades darker. Her legs were long and elegant, her head proudly arched as she regarded the visitors with intelligent eyes. "This is Ember," Jacob said softly, a note of reverence in his voice. "Finest horse I've ever bred. Her dam was a Morgan I brought from back east, her sire a Spanish Mustang with bloodlines going back to the horses the conquistadors brought over." He reached over the fence, and the mare approached, nuzzling his palm. "She's special. Got the spirit of the wild horses with the grace and intelligence of the best Eastern bloodstock." Emma watched in fascination as the beautiful animal pressed her velvet nose into Jacob's hand. "She's magnificent," she murmured. Jacob turned to her, his expression suddenly serious. "She's also yours if you'll have her." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "What?" "I've been training her specially," Jacob explained. "She's spirited but gentle, perfect for a rider who knows horses but might be a bit out of practice." His eyes held her steadily. You mentioned once how you missed riding, how it was one of the things that brought you joy before. He didn't need to finish the thought before James left. Before grief had confined her to the narrow boundaries of her house and her pain. Jacob, I couldn't possibly accept such a gift, Emma protested, though her eyes were drawn back to the beautiful mare. She must be worth. This isn't about worth, Jacob interrupted gently. It's about seeing you smile again, about helping you reclaim something you've lost. He took her hand in his calloused one, his touch sending warmth up her arm. Please, Emma, let me do this for you. In that moment, looking into Jacob's earnest blue eyes, Emma felt something break and reform within her, a wall crumbling, a door opening. This man, with his quiet strength and unwavering kindness, had somehow found his way past all her defenses to touch her heart. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I accept. The smile that spread across Jacob's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. You won't regret it. She's a special horse for a special lady. Emma blushed at his words, suddenly acutely aware of his hand still holding hers, of how close they were standing. She pulled back slightly, not ready for the feelings stirring within her. Would it be all right if I rode her now? She asked, changing the subject. Jacob nodded, understanding in his eyes. Of course. Let me saddle her for you. As Emma watched Jacob prepare the mare, moving with the efficiency of long practice, she felt a strange sense of standing at a crossroads. Accepting this gift felt significant in ways that went beyond a simple act of generosity. It was a step toward a future different from the one she had envisioned with James, a future that now included Jacob Norwood in ways she wasn't yet ready to fully examine. The ride back to town that evening, Emma on Ember and Jacob on his gelding, was filled with a comfortable silence. The setting sun painted the landscape in gold and amber hues that matched Ember's gleaming coat, and Emma felt a lightness in her spirit that had been absent for too long. At her gate, Jacob helped her dismount and showed her how to secure Ember in the small stable behind her house, a space that had stood empty since James had sold their previous horse to fund his journey west. I'll bring by some feed tomorrow, Jacob promised as they stood in the gathering twilight. And we can go riding again soon if you'd like. Emma nodded, stroking Ember's sleek neck. I'd like that very much. As Jacob prepared to leave, Emma impulsively caught his hand. Thank you, Jacob, not just for Ember but for everything these past weeks. For the coffee and the company when I needed it most. Jacob's eyes softened as he looked down at her. You don't need to thank me, Emma. Seeing you come back to life has been reward enough. There was a moment, brief but charged with possibility, when Emma thought he might lean down and kiss her. Instead, he gently squeezed her hand before releasing it. Good night, Emma. Sweet dreams. As she watched him ride away, Emma touched her fingers to her lips, wondering what it might have felt like if he had kissed her and why a part of her wished that he had. June brought scorching heat and cloudless skies to Wheatland. The days stretched long and languid, with the sun baking the earth and sending heat waves shimmering above the dusty streets. For Emma, the summer days took on a new rhythm, structured around caring for Ember, tending her small garden, and increasingly frequent rides with Jacob on horseback. Emma discovered a freedom she had almost forgotten. Astride Ember, with the wind in her hair and the vast Wyoming landscape spread before her, she could outpace her grief, leaving it behind like the dust trails that followed their hoofbeats. Jacob taught her the trails around Wheatland, showing her hidden valleys where wildflowers bloomed in riotous profusion and secluded streams where they could rest their horses and enjoy a simple packed lunch in the shade of cottonwood trees. During these rides, their conversations deepened, moving beyond the careful boundaries they had established in the early days of their friendship. Emma found herself sharing more of her fears and disappointments, how James had grown increasingly restless in their marriage, how his dreams of adventure had always seemed to exclude her, how his departure had left her questioning her own worth. In turn, Jacob spoke of his own struggles, the loneliness of building his ranch alone, his worries about the future, his fears that he might never have a family to share his life and work. There was an honesty between them now, a trust that had grown slowly but steadily over the weeks of shared coffee and conversation. What remained unspoken, however, was the growing attraction between them. It lived in the lingering glances, in the way Jacob's hand would rest briefly on Emma's shoulder or the small of her back, in how Emma found herself watching for his arrival each evening with quickening pulse and brightening eyes. Neither was ready to acknowledge it directly, with Emma's marriage still legally intact, and Jacob's innate respect for her position keeping him from declaring feelings that grew stronger with each passing day. One sweltering afternoon in late June, Emma sat on her porch shelling peas and contemplating this complicated situation when Sheriff Williams's deputy, young Thomas Fuller, rode up to her gate. "Afternoon, Mrs. Keating," he called, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "Got something for you." He dismounted and approached, holding out an envelope. "Came in on yesterday's stage from California." Emma's heart lurched painfully in her chest as she took the letter. She recognized James's handwriting immediately, the bold, slanting script as familiar to her as her own reflection. "Thank you, Deputy," she managed to say, her voice remarkably steady despite the turmoil within. After Thomas rode away, Emma sat staring at the envelope for a long time, unable to summon the courage to open it. What could James possibly have to say after nearly 6 months of silence? What words could justify the emptiness and pain he had left in his wake? With trembling fingers, she finally broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. "Dear Emma," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well. Life in California has been both challenging and rewarding. The gold fields aren't yielding quite what I'd hoped, but I've found work with a shipping company in San Francisco that promises steady pay and opportunities for advancement." Emma read on as James described his new life in the bustling port city, the sights and sounds, the diverse peoples, the sense of standing at the edge of a new frontier. Not once did he mention missing her or plans to send for her. Instead, the letter concluded with words that struck her like physical blows. "I've come to realize that the life we built together was never truly what I wanted, Emma. You deserve someone who can be content with the quiet existence you crave, while I need freedom and adventure. I believe it would be best for both of us to make a clean break. I've enclosed papers for a divorce, which you need only sign and return to the lawyer whose address is included. I wish you every happiness and hope you can forgive me for not being the husband you deserved." Enclosed with the letter was indeed a set of legal documents, divorce papers, citing irreconcilable differences as the grounds for dissolving their 5-year marriage. James had already signed his name at the bottom, the bold strokes of his pen a final confirmation of his abandonment. Emma sat motionless as the sun crept lower in the sky, the letter clutched in her hand and tears tracking silently down her cheeks. She had spent months waiting, hoping, making excuses for James's absence. Now, with a few strokes of a pen, he had severed the ties that bound them, casting her adrift in a life she had never imagined for herself. She was still sitting there, numb with shock, when Jacob arrived for his customary evening visit. One look at her face told him something was terribly wrong. "Emma," he asked gently, taking the porch steps in 2 long strides. "What's happened?" Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. Jacob read it quickly, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he carefully folded the paper and handed it back to her, his movements controlled despite the anger evident in the tight line of his jaw. "I'm so sorry, Emma," he said softly. "That's a cruel way to end things." Emma looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but dry now. "The strange thing is, I think I've known for months that he wasn't coming back. I just couldn't admit it to myself." She glanced down at the divorce papers in her lap. "Now I have no choice but to face the truth." Jacob knelt beside her chair, taking one of her hands in both of his. "You don't have to face it alone, Emma. You have friends here, you have." He hesitated, then finished simply, "You have me." The sincerity in his eyes was Emma's undoing. The tears she thought had run dry welled up again, and a sob escaped her lips. Jacob didn't hesitate. He gathered her into his arms, holding her against his chest as she wept for the marriage that had failed, for the years she had invested in a man who had walked away, for the future she had lost. "I don't know who I am anymore," she confessed between sobs. "If I'm not James's wife, who am I?" Jacob stroked her hair, his voice a gentle rumble against her ear. "You're Emma Keating. You're strong and kind and braver than you know. You're a woman who can ride like the wind on that copper mare, who makes the best apple pie in 3 counties, who sings like an angel in the church choir." He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. "You're so much more than just someone's wife, Emma. You always have been." His words were a balm to her wounded spirit, offering a perspective she hadn't been able to find on her own. Emma realized that while James had been gone physically for 6 months, emotionally he had departed long before that, and perhaps, in some ways, she had been grieving not just his absence but the slow death of their marriage over the preceding years. "Thank you," she whispered, slowly pulling away from Jacob's embrace, "for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." They sat together on the porch as twilight deepened into night, not speaking much but drawing comfort from each other's presence. When Jacob finally rose to leave, he hesitated, clearly wrestling with what to say. "Emma," he began carefully, "I know this isn't the right time. You've just received news that's turned your world upside down again. But I want you to know that whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." He took a deep breath. "I care for you more than I probably should admit right now, but I can be patient. I will be patient." Emma looked up at him, this steadfast man who had brought coffee and company when she needed it most, who had never pushed or presumed, who had somehow become the most important person in her world without her fully realizing it. "Thank you for understanding," she said softly. "I need time to think, to decide what happens next." Jacob nodded, his eyes warm with unspoken emotion. "Take all the time you need, Emma. I'm not going anywhere." After he left, Emma sat alone in the darkness for a long while, the divorce papers in her lap, her thoughts a jumble of grief, anger, and unexpectedly relief. James's letter, cruel as it was, had freed her from the limbo of waiting, from the uncertainty that had plagued her for months. Now she could choose her own path forward, make her own decisions about what her life would become. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a quiet voice whispered that perhaps this ending was also a beginning of what? She wasn't yet sure, but the possibility no longer seemed as frightening as it once had. The following Sunday, Emma attended church with the divorce papers signed and sealed in her reticule. After the service, she asked Sheriff Williams for directions to the post office, intending to mail the documents to the lawyer in San Francisco, whose address James had provided. The sheriff regarded her with kind eyes. "Sending those papers back, are you?" News traveled fast in Wheatland, and Emma wasn't surprised that he knew about James's letter. "Yes," she answered simply. "It's time to move forward." Sheriff Williams nodded. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Keating, I think you're doing the right thing. A man who'd leave a woman like you behind doesn't deserve a second chance." He cleared his throat, looking slightly embarrassed at his forthrightness. "The post office is closed Sundays, but if you'd like, I can make sure your letter goes out with tomorrow morning's mail." Emma handed him the envelope, feeling a strange lightness as it left her possession. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'd appreciate that." As she turned to leave, the sheriff added, "Jacob Norwood's a good man, Mrs. Keating. Just thought you should know that." A blush colored Emma's cheeks. "I'm well aware of Mr. Norwood's character, Sheriff, but I'm still a married woman, at least until these papers are processed." Sheriff Williams tipped his hat. "Of course, madam. Just making an observation." That afternoon, Emma removed her wedding ring for the first time in 5 years, placing it in a small box along with the few letters James had sent during their marriage. She wasn't ready to dispose of these mementos. They represented a significant chapter in her life. After all, but she no longer needed to carry the weight of that gold band on her finger. The summer days continued to pass, bringing with them a gradual healing. Emma threw herself into the rhythms of life in Wheatland, with new energy, playing the piano for church services again, joining the quilting circle, helping with preparations for the upcoming Independence Day celebration. The townsfolk, seeing her emerge from her shell, embraced her return to community life with warmth and acceptance. Jacob remained a constant presence, though he was careful to respect the boundaries Emma had established. Their evening visits continued, but he was careful not to press for more than friendship, understanding that she needed time to rediscover herself before considering a new relationship. Emma appreciated his patience, even as she found herself increasingly drawn to him. There was a steadiness to Jacob that James had never possessed, a contentment with the life he had built that made him fundamentally different from her restless former husband. Where James had always been looking toward the horizon, searching for something better elsewhere, Jacob found joy in the here and now, in the land he worked, the horses he raised, the community he was part of. By the time July 4th arrived, Emma had made peace with the end of her marriage, though the official divorce decree had not yet arrived from California. The town of Wheatland celebrated Independence Day with typical frontier enthusiasm, a parade down Main Street, competitions of strength and skill for the men, baking contests for the women, and a community picnic followed by dancing and fireworks. Emma wore a new dress for the occasion, a pretty creation of white muslin with sprigs of red flowers that she had sewn herself over the preceding weeks. Her honey blonde hair was arranged in soft curls, and she carried a parasol to protect her fair skin from the intense summer sun. Jacob found her at the picnic, his eyes widening appreciatively at the sight of her. "You look beautiful, Emma," he said, the sincerity in his voice making her blush. "Thank you," she replied, noting how handsome he looked in his Sunday best. "You're not looking too shabby yourself." They spent the day in each other's company, moving through the festivities with an ease that drew knowing smiles from their neighbors. When evening fell and the dancing began, Jacob led Emma onto the floor without hesitation, her hand fitting perfectly in his as they joined the other couples. As they moved through the steps of a Virginia reel, Emma caught Mrs. Harper watching them with approval, leaning to whisper something to her husband that made him nod and smile. Once, such scrutiny would have made Emma uncomfortable, but now she found she didn't mind. Let them talk. She was no longer defined by James's abandonment, but by the life she was rebuilding, day by day, choice by choice. Later, as they stood together watching the fireworks explode in brilliant bursts against the night sky, Jacob's hand found hers in the darkness. His fingers intertwined with hers, warm and strong, and Emma didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned slightly against his shoulder, taking comfort in his solid presence beside her. "Beautiful," she murmured as a shower of golden sparks cascaded through the blackness. "Yes," Jacob agreed. But when Emma glanced up, she found him looking not at the fireworks but at her, his expression so tender it made her heart skip a beat. In that moment, with the colors of the fireworks reflecting in his blue eyes and the sounds of celebration surrounding them, Emma knew with sudden clarity that she was falling in love with Jacob Norwood. The realization should have frightened her after the pain of James's betrayal, but instead it filled her with a quiet joy, a sense of rightness that had been missing from her life for longer than she cared to remember. She squeezed his hand gently, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken feelings between them. Jacob's answering smile was like a promise, patient and steadfast, asking nothing but offering everything. 2 weeks later, on a warm July evening, Emma sat at her piano for the first time since James had left, her fingers moving hesitantly over the keys as she recalled pieces she had once played with confidence. The music was halting at first, stumbling through forgotten passages, but gradually her muscle memory returned, and the notes flowed more smoothly. She was so absorbed in the music that she didn't hear Jacob's knock at first. When she finally registered the sound and called for him to enter, she found him standing in the doorway of the parlor, an expression of wonder on his face. "Don't stop," he said as she began to rise. "Please, it's beautiful." Shyly, Emma returned to the piano bench, continuing the simple melody she had been playing. Jacob moved into the room and stood beside the piano, watching her hands move across the keys with evident admiration. "I didn't know you played so well," he said when she finally finished. Emma smiled ruefully. "I'm terribly out of practice. James never cared much for music, so gradually I stopped playing." She ran her fingers lightly over the keys. "It feels good to rediscover it." Jacob's expression darkened briefly at the mention of James, but he quickly schooled his features. "Music like that shouldn't be silenced," he said. "You have a gift, Emma. Thank you." She gestured for him to sit beside her on the bench. "Do you play at all?" Jacob chuckled, shaking his head as he settled next to her. "Not a note. My talents lie elsewhere, I'm afraid." "With horses," Emma supplied, smiling at him, "and building things." She hesitated, then added softly, "and being there for people when they need you most." Their eyes met, and Emma was suddenly acutely aware of how close they were sitting, their shoulders nearly touching on the narrow piano bench. The air between them seemed charged with possibility. "Emma," Jacob began, his voice low and serious, "I've been thinking about what you said after you received James's letter about needing time. I've tried to respect that to give you the space to heal." He took a deep breath. "But I find myself hoping that maybe, someday soon." He trailed off, clearly struggling to find the right words. Emma felt a surge of tenderness for this strong, capable man who could break wild horses, but stumbled over expressing his feelings. "Jacob," she said softly, placing her hand over his where it rested on his knee. "I received the final divorce decree yesterday. It came in the mail from San Francisco." Jacob's eyes widened slightly. "You didn't mention it when I saw you in town." "I needed time to think," Emma explained. "To be sure of what I wanted next." She looked down at their hands, her smaller one covering his larger, work-roughened one. "The truth is, Jacob, you've become more important to me than I ever expected. When you brought me coffee that first evening and said you'd keep me company, I had no idea how much I would come to depend on that company to look forward to it, too." She hesitated, then finished simply, "To need it." Jacob turned his hand beneath hers, entwining their fingers. "Emma," he said, her name a caress on his lips. "I think I've been falling in love with you since that first evening. I tried not to, knowing you were still tied to James. But watching you rebuild your life, seeing your strength and grace through all of this, how could I not love you?" The word hung between them, both a declaration and a question. Emma felt tears spring to her eyes, not of grief this time, but of a joy so unexpected and profound it overwhelmed her. "I think I love you too, Jacob," she whispered. "It scared me at first. After James, I wasn't sure I could trust those feelings again. But you're nothing like him. You're steady and true," and her words were cut short as Jacob leaned forward, closing the small distance between them to press his lips gently against hers. The kiss was tender, almost reverent, his hand coming up to cradle her cheek as if she were something infinitely precious. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for months," he admitted with a soft laugh. Emma smiled, her heart feeling too full for her chest to contain. "I'm glad you waited until now," she said. "I needed to be whole again before I could offer my heart to someone else." Jacob nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And now?" "Now," Emma replied, her voice steady with newfound certainty. "I think I'm ready to start a new chapter. With you, if that's what you want." Jacob's answer was another kiss, deeper this time, filled with promise and longing and the sweet relief of feelings finally expressed. Emma melted into him, her arms winding around his neck as she returned his kiss with equal fervor, the final walls around her heart crumbling in the face of this man's steadfast love. The weeks that followed were a time of discovery for Emma and Jacob. They spent every available moment together, learning the contours of their new relationship with the wonder of people who had found something precious when they least expected it. Jacob took Emma riding across his land, showing her the places he loved best, the grove of aspens where he sometimes camped on summer nights, the high ridge that offered views all the way to the distant mountains, the clear pool in Thompson Creek where trout darted in the shadows. Emma shared her own passions, teaching Jacob to appreciate music, reading poetry aloud to him on lazy Sunday afternoons, baking his favorite apple pies and laughing at his unabashed enjoyment of them. By the time autumn painted the landscape in golds and crimsons, their courtship had become the worst-kept secret in Wheatland. They made no effort to hide their affection, though they maintained propriety in public, holding hands during walks through town, sharing dances at social gatherings, exchanging glances across the church during Sunday services that spoke volumes about their feelings for each other. On a crisp October evening, with the first hint of winter in the air, Jacob took Emma riding to a special spot on his property, a small plateau overlooking the valley, where the setting sun bathed everything in golden light. He spread a blanket on the ground and they sat together, Emma leaning back against his chest as they watched the sun sink toward the horizon. "I've been thinking," Jacob said, his voice rumbling pleasantly against her back, "about the future." Emma turned slightly to see his face. "What about it?" Jacob's expression was serious, but his eyes were warm with love. "My cabin was built for one, Emma. It served me well enough as a bachelor, but it's too small for a family." He paused, gauging her reaction. "I've drawn up plans to expand it, another bedroom, a larger kitchen, a proper parlor where you could put your piano." Emma's heart quickened. "That sounds lovely, Jacob, but why are you telling me this now?" In answer, Jacob reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. Taking Emma's hand, he poured the contents into her palm, a ring of polished gold set with a single, perfect pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds that caught the last rays of sunlight. "Because I'm hoping you'll share that home with me, Emma Keating," he said softly. "As my wife." Emma stared at the beautiful ring, then up at Jacob's face, her eyes filling with tears of joy. "Jacob, I know it might seem soon," he continued earnestly, "and if you need more time, I understand. But I love you, Emma." I want to build a life with you, to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night. I want to give you the happiness you deserve, to grow old together watching our children and grandchildren thrive on this land." He took a deep breath. "Emma Keating, will you marry me?" Emma closed her fingers around the ring, her heart so full she thought it might burst. 6 months ago, she had been a broken woman, shattered by abandonment and loss. Now, because one kind man had brought coffee and company when she needed it most, she was being offered a second chance at love and happiness. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, Jacob Norwood, I will marry you." The joy that transformed his face was something Emma knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Jacob pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless, before taking the ring and slipping it onto her finger where it fit perfectly, as if made for her. "I promise to love you every day of my life, Emma," he whispered against her lips. "To cherish you and honor you and never make you doubt for a single moment that you are the center of my world." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above them, Emma leaned her head against Jacob's shoulder, feeling a peace and contentment she had never known before. The grief that had once consumed her had transformed, through time and love and her own inner strength, into something new, a deeper appreciation for joy, a more profound understanding of what truly mattered in life. "I love you, Jacob," she said softly. "Thank you for keeping me company when I needed it most." Jacob's arms tightened around her, his kiss on her forehead a wordless promise of all the days they would share, all the love that awaited them in the life they would build together. Emma and Jacob were married on Christmas Eve, 1875, in the small church in Wheatland that had witnessed so many chapters of their story. Snow fell gently outside the windows as they spoke their vows, blanketing the world in pristine white that seemed to symbolize the fresh start they were making together. Emma wore a gown of ivory satin with lace her mother had sent from Illinois when she heard the news of her daughter's engagement. Jacob looked handsome and slightly nervous in a new black suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed his bride with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic ranchers in attendance. The entire town turned out for the celebration afterward, held in the church hall decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the holiday season. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and countless well wishes for the couple who had found love when neither was looking for it. "You look so happy," Mrs. Harper said to Emma during a quiet moment. "It does my heart good to see it, after everything you've been through." Emma smiled, her eyes finding Jacob across the room where he was speaking with Sheriff Williams. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his face lighting with a smile that was for her alone. "I am happy," Emma replied truthfully. "Happier than I ever thought possible." Later that night, after the celebration had ended and they had retreated to Jacob's cabin, now their cabin, Emma stood by the window watching the snow continue to fall, a sense of wonder filling her at how drastically her life had changed in the span of a year. Jacob came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing a kiss to her temple. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Norwood?" he asked, the new name sending a thrill through her. "About how strange life is," Emma replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "A year ago I was alone and grieving, convinced my life was over. Now here I am, starting a new life with a man I love more than I ever thought possible." She turned in his arms to face him. "It's like a miracle, Jacob." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "If it's a miracle, Emma, it's one you helped create. Your strength, your courage in the face of heartbreak, those are what brought you to this moment." He kissed her gently. "I'm just grateful I get to be part of your story." "Not just part of it," Emma corrected, her arms twining around his neck. "You're the best chapter, Jacob Norwood, and we're just getting started." As snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the Wyoming landscape in its quiet beauty, Emma and Jacob began their life together in the warmth of their home and the certainty of their love, a love born from grief and kindness, nurtured through patience and understanding, and destined to grow stronger with each passing day. In the years that followed, Emma and Jacob built the life they had dreamed of together. Jacob expanded the cabin as promised, creating a comfortable home filled with music and laughter. Emma's piano took pride of place in the new parlor, and many evenings were spent with Jacob listening contentedly as Emma played, sometimes singing along in his rich baritone that improved considerably under her tutelage. Their ranch prospered as Jacob's reputation for breeding exceptional horses spread throughout the territory. Emma proved to be an excellent partner in the business, her eye for horseflesh and her gentle way with the animals complementing Jacob's training skills perfectly. Together, they built the Norwood Ranch into one of the most respected horse breeding operations in Wyoming Territory. In the spring of 1877, their family grew with the birth of their first child, a son they named William, after Jacob's father. Emma found motherhood to be a joy beyond description, and Jacob proved to be a devoted, doting father who spent hours walking the floor with their colicky infant, singing off key lullabies that somehow soothed the fretful baby when nothing else would. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Sarah, with her mother's honey blonde hair and her father's blue eyes. And in 1882, their family was completed with the arrival of another son, Michael, a mischievous child who kept his parents on their toes from the moment he could crawl. Through the years, Emma occasionally received news of James through mutual acquaintances. He had remarried to a San Francisco socialite and found success in the shipping business. Emma felt no bitterness when she heard these reports, only a distant sense of gratitude that their paths had diverged, allowing both to find the lives they were meant to live. On a warm summer evening in 1885, 10 years after Jacob had first knocked on Emma's door with coffee and company, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard with the new puppy Jacob had brought home the week before. William, at 8, was already showing his father's skill with animals. 7-year-old Sarah sat nearby, making daisy chains with serious concentration, while 3-year-old Michael chased the puppy in dizzying circles, his laughter ringing out across the homestead. "We've done well, haven't we?" Jacob said, his hand finding Emma's where it rested on the arm of her rocking chair. Emma smiled, taking in the scene before her, the beautiful home they had built together, the thriving ranch, their healthy, happy children. But most of all, she treasured the man beside her, whose love had never wavered, whose strength had supported her through good times and bad, whose patience and kindness had healed wounds she once thought would never mend. "Very well indeed," she agreed, squeezing his hand. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." Jacob lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with the same tenderness he had shown on that long-ago evening when he had first appeared at her door. "I love you, Emma Norwood," he said simply. "More today than yesterday, but not as much as tomorrow." As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Emma leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, her heart full of gratitude for the life they had created together. From the depths of grief, she had found her way to a joy more profound than she had ever imagined possible, all because one kind-hearted cowboy had brought coffee and offered to keep her company when she needed it most. And in the end, that simple act of compassion had led to the greatest love story either of them could have written, a story of healing, of hope, and of a happiness that would sustain them all the days of their lives.